The story begins in silence. Imagine walking through the ruins of a city long forgotten by time, where broken columns rise like shadows and the earth is still scarred by fire that burned thousands of years ago. The night air is cool, and the moonlight touches the stones with a pale glow. You step carefully over fallen masonry, your footsteps echoing faintly as if you are not alone. The wind carries with it the faint memory of smoke, a scent that does not exist anymore but lingers in the imagination. The question comes unbidden: why would a king, blessed with power, wealth, and glory, choose to set fire to the very city he had built as his crown jewel? This story is not merely about flames and destruction. It is about ambition and fear, about creation and loss, about the fragile balance between vision and ruin. Long before the city was reduced to ashes, it had been a dream brought to life by the hands of architects, workers, and visionaries under the command of a ruler who saw himself as more than just a man. To him, the city was not just stone and mortar. It was an extension of his soul, his identity carved into the earth, his claim to immortality. Yet history reminds us that even the brightest dreams can collapse in a single night. The burning of this city is not only a tale of destruction but a mirror reflecting the paradox of human nature. For what we build in pride, we often destroy in fear. What we nurture in hope, we sometimes abandon in despair. And what we seek to preserve forever can vanish in a moment of fire. To truly understand the night of flames, one must return to the beginning, to the king himself and the dream he carried. He was not born to fire. He was born to ambition. His childhood, marked by hardship and desire, shaped him into a leader who longed for permanence in a world where nothing lasts. He rose against rivals, survived betrayals, and built his power until he stood alone at the summit. When he founded his city, he imagined it as a beacon that would outlast the centuries, a monument not only to his reign but to the very idea of civilization itself. But the ruins whisper something different. They speak of pride that turned into obsession. They speak of a mind that could not rest, even when surrounded by triumph. They remind us that glory and fragility often walk side by side. For every city that has ever stood as a marvel of its age, there has always been the possibility of its fall. And in this story, the fall did not come from an enemy's sword or the hand of a conqueror. It came from within. It came from the very man who was supposed to protect it. Imagine standing in the city before the fire, when its streets were alive with life. Merchants calling out their wares, children running in the sun, priests chanting in the temples, the king himself walking among his people in robes glittering with gold thread. The air would have been thick with spice and incense, with the sound of music echoing from the courtyards. The city was not just a place to live, it was a stage where the king performed his greatness. And yet, in the shadow of that splendor, the seeds of destruction were already being planted. Why, then, would he burn it? Was it madness? Was it strategy? Was it the final act of a man who would rather destroy his dream than see it stolen by another? History has left us no simple answer. What we have are fragments, accounts written centuries later, half-truths wrapped in myth. Some say he did it to deny his enemies the joy of conquest, leaving them only ashes instead of treasure. Others believe he burned it in a ritual of purification, convinced that fire would cleanse corruption and betrayal festering within the walls. And still others whisper of paranoia so consuming that he could no longer tell friend from foe, city from threat. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Perhaps the fire was both an act of desperation and of control, both a punishment and a release. Perhaps in burning the city, he sought to leave behind not just ruin but a legacy that would outlast memory. For fire, though it destroys, also immortalizes. Stone can crumble quietly, forgotten in the passage of centuries, but ashes carry stories. And here we are, still speaking of him, still wandering through the ruins he left behind. As you listen, let the images form gently in your mind. A city glowing like a jewel under the sun, a king standing proudly at its heart, and then, in one fateful night, that jewel consumed by flame. See the fire rising high, painting the sky with red and gold, the sound of collapsing roofs, the cries of citizens fleeing, the heat pressing against the skin. And then, silence. The silence of smoke rising from what had been hope only hours before. This story is not told to shock or to frighten. It is told as a reminder, soft and steady, that history is shaped not only by triumphs but also by losses. Every civilization carries within it the seeds of its own destruction, and every ruler, no matter how powerful, is vulnerable to the same human fears that haunt us all. The Forgotten Flame is not just about a city. It is about us. About the choices we make when faced with fear, about the fragile beauty of dreams, about the reality that nothing, no matter how grand, can last forever. Tonight, as you listen, let the ruins of this city rise in your imagination. Walk its streets, feel its pulse, and then stand beside its king on the night of fire. Do not rush to judgment, for history is never simple. Instead, listen to the echoes. They will guide us deeper, from the ashes back to the dawn, from the fire to the dream that came before. Only then can we begin to understand why an ancient king chose to burn his own city to the ground. The story of a city always begins with an idea. Long before the stones were laid, before the walls rose high, before the palaces gleamed under the sun, there was a vision in the mind of a single man. The king, still early in his reign, stood upon a stretch of untouched land and imagined what could be. Where others saw wilderness and rivers, he saw streets and towers. Where others saw soil and rock, he envisioned a capital that would shine brighter than any before it. The dream was not small. It was immense, audacious, and filled with the certainty that only ambition can give. He wanted a city that would not merely serve as a place of shelter but as a monument to his name. In a world where empires rose and fell with the seasons, where memory could be erased by war or famine, he longed for permanence. The city he imagined would not just be lived in, it would be remembered. It would declare to every rival kingdom, to every distant traveler, and to every generation yet unborn that here lived a king who shaped the world with his will. The first stones were laid with ceremony. Priests chanted blessings, offerings were buried beneath the foundations, and the people cheered as the dream took form. Every detail mattered. The avenues were to be wide and straight, lined with trees that gave shade to merchants and poets alike. The walls would rise thick and high, both a defense and a declaration of strength. Within those walls, temples soared toward the heavens, their roofs covered in gold that glistened in the morning sun. Palaces stretched in courtyards and gardens, fountains spilling water as though abundance itself flowed from the king's hand. Day by day, the city grew, and with it, the hope of its people. Workers toiled under the heat, artisans carved intricate designs, and foreign traders brought rare stones and timber to contribute to its rising glory. The air was filled with the sound of hammers, chisels, and songs of labor. For many, it was backbreaking work. But they believed, or were made to believe, that they were part of something eternal. To live in such a city was to be part of history. The king walked often among the construction, his eyes sharp, his voice commanding, his presence both inspiring and intimidating. He corrected, he demanded, and at times he praised. To his subjects, he appeared almost larger than life, not just a ruler, but a figure chosen by fate to bring forth this marvel. His dream became their burden, but also their pride. Even the humblest farmer could point to the rising skyline and say, "I am part of this." With the passing years, the city began to take on the shape of its master's imagination. The central square became the heart, where festivals unfolded, where the people gathered in celebration and in grief. The great avenues pulsed with life, lined with markets overflowing with silks, spices, and bright pottery. The temples became places where the gods themselves were thought to walk among mortals, their statues towering and adorned with offerings of gold and precious stones. And above all, the king's palace crowned the city, a fortress of beauty and strength, visible from miles away. It was not merely practical architecture. It was a message. To allies, it spoke of prosperity and stability. To enemies, it shouted power and intimidation. To his own people, it reminded them that their ruler was no ordinary man, but one chosen to lift them above the dust of obscurity into the light of greatness. Yet even in these early years, whispers traveled quietly through the crowds. Some wondered at the cost of such splendor. Farmers sent grain to feed the builders rather than their own children. Men and women gave their strength, and sometimes their lives, to raise structures they would never enter. There were rumors that taxes weighed heavily, that noble families grew resentful of the king's demand for resources, and that not all rejoiced in this dream. But the voices of dissent were drowned out by the grandeur rising around them. For most, the sight of a city unlike any other silenced doubt, at least for a time. The king himself never wavered. He would walk to the highest points of the land and look down upon his creation, smiling with pride. To him, it was not just stone and mortar, not just trade and defense. It was a reflection of himself. He had come from struggle, from rivalry, from nights of uncertainty, and now he commanded a living monument. The city was not merely his capital, it was his soul, cast into form, a promise that he would never be forgotten. The dream seemed unshakable. Travelers came from distant lands to marvel at it. Poets sang of it. Merchants praised its markets. Envoys reported back to their kings in awe. It became a place not only of wealth but of wonder, a beacon that drew people from every direction. And with each passing year, the king grew more convinced that he had achieved what others could not, immortality through creation. But beneath the triumph lay a truth hidden in plain sight. No dream, no matter how dazzling, is without its shadow. A city is not only stone and glory but also people, people with fears, needs, and voices that cannot always be silenced. A king may dream of eternity, but he cannot command the hearts of every soul within his walls. Though the city glittered like a jewel, faint cracks were already forming. For now, however, the cracks were invisible. What mattered was the dream, a dream realized on a scale few dared to imagine. The city stood complete, a marvel of its age, a symbol of human ambition, and a promise to the gods themselves. To stand within its walls was to believe in greatness, to forget the fragility of life, and to feel as though the city itself might last forever. The king's dream had come to life. The birth of the city was complete. It was a place of beauty, of power, of vision. It was a promise of eternity. Yet, as history often reminds us, eternity is fragile, and every promise carries within it the possibility of being broken. The city was born in ambition and hope. In time, it would die in fire and despair. But in this moment, in its birth, it gleamed with all the brilliance of a dream made real. Every great city is born from the vision of its ruler, but every ruler is shaped by the story of his rise. To understand why the king built his dream, and why he later burned it, we must travel back to the beginning of his journey. Long before he stood as master of a glorious capital, he was simply a boy, a figure shaped by hardship, ambition, and the endless struggle for survival in a world where kingdoms clashed like storms and power was the only shield against ruin. He was not born into peace. His childhood unfolded in an age of conflict, where rival clans and shifting alliances determined the fate of entire families. From an early age, he learned that safety was an illusion, that trust was fragile, and that strength was the only currency that mattered. Some accounts say he was the son of a minor noble, others that his bloodline traced to kings of old, but what matters is not the certainty of birth but the certainty of character. Even as a boy, he carried within him a fire, a restless energy that set him apart from others. Stories are told of his early trials. One tale speaks of the night when enemies descended upon his household, torches in hand, demanding submission or death. The young boy, barely more than a child, witnessed the chaos, the shouts, the blood, the desperate escape into the wilderness. Another story recalls how, as a youth, he challenged a rival twice his age in a contest of strength and emerged victorious, his determination frightening even his allies. Whether these tales are embroidered by legend or grounded in truth, they all point to the same truth. He grew in the crucible of struggle, and from that crucible emerged a will unbending. By the time he reached manhood, the boy had become a warrior, and the warrior was on the path to becoming a leader. He mastered the arts of battle not merely with sword and spear, but with mind and voice. He studied the strategies of enemies, learned the weaknesses of allies, and cultivated the ability to read men's hearts. To his companions, he was more than a fighter. He was a presence that drew loyalty, that inspired belief. To his rivals, he was a shadow on the horizon, a force that could not be ignored. The rise was not simple, nor was it clean. Power is never granted freely. He fought for it, seized it, defended it against those who sought to strip it away. In skirmishes and sieges, in negotiations and betrayals, he carved his way upward. Step by step, victory by victory, he gained territory, wealth, and followers. Those who once dismissed him as a reckless youth soon found themselves bowing before him. Those who stood in his path often found themselves erased from memory, their names swallowed by history. But ambition alone does not crown a king. What set him apart was vision. Many warriors can win battles, but few can imagine beyond them. He dreamed not only of conquest but of permanence, of a realm that would endure. He saw the futility of endless cycles of violence, where cities rose only to be toppled, where names were spoken only to be forgotten. He wanted more. He wanted to shape destiny itself. When at last he claimed the throne, it was not simply the result of force. It was the culmination of a lifetime of struggle, of lessons learned in hardship, of charisma honed in the fires of survival. He stood before his people not merely as a victor but as a symbol of what ambition could achieve. The boy who once ran from flames now commanded armies. The youth who once fought for recognition now demanded obedience. The man who once dreamed in silence now spoke with the authority of a king. The court transformed under his rule. Where others saw chaos, he imposed order. Where nobles schemed, he bent them to his will. He reorganized armies, reshaped laws, and asserted his dominance in every corner of his realm. Even those who hated him could not deny his brilliance. He was calculating, sharp, and relentless. He rewarded loyalty with riches and punished treachery with merciless swiftness. His reign was not gentle, but it was effective. Beyond the court, his reputation spread like wildfire. Neighboring rulers learned to tread carefully. Some sought his alliance, others plotted against him, but all recognized his presence. His name became a weight, carried in whispers by merchants, sung in taverns by storytellers, cursed in the halls of his enemies. He had risen from obscurity into the full blaze of power, and he intended never to let it go. Yet with power came burden. The higher he rose, the more he feared the fall. Every rival defeated created new rivals eager to replace them. Every alliance forged carried the seed of future betrayal. He began to look not only at what he had gained but at what he could lose. It was in this moment, in the height of his rise, that the first traces of the paranoia that would later consume him began to appear. He had achieved greatness, but greatness carries shadows. Still, in these years of ascent, hope overshadowed fear. He married his victories with a dream larger than himself, the founding of the city. To him, the city was proof of his triumph, the crown upon his rise. It was a statement to his enemies, a promise to his allies, and a gift to his people. In the gleaming stones and wide streets, in the temples and markets, was the echo of his journey, from fire and hardship to power and vision. The city was his rise made visible, his story etched into stone for generations to see. His rise was not without flaws. He could be ruthless, quick to anger, unwilling to forgive insult. Some feared him more than they loved him. Others followed him out of necessity rather than devotion. But whether from fear or faith, they followed. And in the end, that was enough. Power does not require love, only obedience. Every empire has a season when it shines brightest, when the world seems to pause and admire its radiance. For the king and his city, that season was the Golden Age. The years that followed the founding were years of prosperity, growth, and wonder. The dream he had carried through hardship was no longer a fragile vision. It was real, solid, magnificent, and alive. The city stood as a marvel of its age, a place where ambition touched the heavens and where people whispered that even the gods themselves might walk among mortals. Step into that age for a moment. The sun rises above the horizon, casting golden light across the city walls. From a distance, the towers gleam as though sculpted from fire itself, the gilded roofs reflecting brilliance into the morning sky. Caravans approach along wide roads, their carts heavy with spices, silks, precious stones, and exotic animals brought from lands far beyond the horizon. Merchants call out in many tongues, voices weaving together in a chorus of trade and ambition. Inside the city gates, the streets are alive. Markets overflow with goods, musicians play flutes and drums, and the aroma of roasting meats and spiced bread fills the air. The people feel secure within their walls. Soldiers stand proudly at their posts, their armor polished, their spears gleaming. Farmers beyond the city provide abundant harvests, filling granaries that promise stability even in leaner times. Scholars gather in courtyards, debating the nature of stars and the mysteries of the soul. Poets recite verses in candlelit halls, their words weaving images of love, honor, and divine destiny. The city hums with energy, with the sense that it is not merely surviving but thriving. At the heart of it all stands the palace. Its courtyards bloom with gardens where fountains spill endlessly into marble basins, reflecting both moonlight and sunlight in a dance of silver and gold. Birds from foreign lands perch in cages of jeweled bronze, their songs mingling with the soft sound of flowing water. Within its halls, columns soar toward painted ceilings, murals telling stories of the king's victories, the founding of the city, and the blessings of the gods. Here, the king receives envoys, hears petitions, and presides over ceremonies that bind the people to him with awe. The king himself basks in this age of splendor. Draped in robes woven from the finest fabrics, adorned with jewels that catch the light, he appears to his subjects as more than a man. To many, he is a symbol of destiny fulfilled, the chosen ruler whose will has turned a barren stretch of land into the beating heart of an empire. When he walks among his people, crowds press forward to glimpse him, to whisper prayers, to touch the hem of his garment in hope that some fragment of his power might pass to them. Festivals mark the seasons, each grander than the last. On days of celebration, the city transforms into a stage of wonder. Dancers twirl in colorful garments, priests carry sacred images through the streets, and the sky bursts with the light of torches and the sound of chants. Food flows freely, wine is poured in rivers, and even the humblest citizen feels for a moment like a participant in something divine. The king, seated upon his throne, watches with satisfaction. To him, these festivals are proof of his success, of a people united under his dream, of a city that has become more than stone, it has become spirit. This golden age is not merely about wealth and beauty. It is about the sense of eternity. The city feels unshakable, as if its walls could never fall, as if its streets will always echo with life. Children grow up believing they are blessed to live in the greatest capital the world has ever known. Foreign visitors return to their homelands with tales of wonder, spreading the legend of the city across mountains and seas. Rivals, hearing these tales, envy what they cannot match. Allies, seeing its splendor, seek its friendship. The city becomes not only a capital but a beacon, drawing the attention of the world. The people themselves live with a mixture of pride and devotion. Artisans carve wonders in stone, their hands guided by both skill and faith. Traders build fortunes in markets where goods from a dozen kingdoms exchange hands each day. Priests proclaim that the gods themselves smile upon the city, for how else could such prosperity endure? Even the poor, though still burdened, take comfort in the grandeur around them, for they too feel part of something eternal. When they look to the palace, when they hear the chants in the temples, when they walk the broad avenues, they feel connected to a destiny larger than themselves. But at the center of this golden glow lies the king's pride. He believes the city to be his masterpiece, his proof to the ages that he is not merely a ruler of men but a shaper of history. He sees himself reflected in every tower, every fountain, every hymn sung in his honor. The city is his shadow and his light, his monument and his mirror. It is both his gift to the world and his claim to immortality. In its splendor, he feels secure, untouchable, certain that his name will never fade. And yet, history teaches us that every golden age carries within it the seeds of its decline. Even as the city gleams, there are murmurs. Nobles, once powerful, grumble at the king's dominance. Merchants grow weary of taxes that fund endless building projects. Commoners whisper about the cost of glory, about the labor demanded, about the sacrifices hidden beneath the marble and gold. For now, those murmurs are quiet, lost beneath the roar of celebration. But like faint cracks in a polished vase, they are there, waiting. The king does not hear them, or perhaps he chooses not to. His focus remains fixed on splendor. He dreams of expanding the city further, of new temples, larger markets, more magnificent palaces. His ambitions stretch endlessly, as if he believes no boundary can hold him. To him, the Golden Age is not a peak but a beginning. He sees no end. He sees only the promise of greater triumphs yet to come. From the outside, the city appears unbreakable. To stand within its walls is to believe in permanence. To walk its avenues is to feel part of eternity. And yet, we know what history will bring. We know that behind the brilliance lies fragility. For now, though, let us remain in the golden age, in the sunlight that shines so brightly it blinds. The city gleams, the king reigns, and the people believe they are living within the very heart of destiny. The golden age was the crown of the king's rise, the fulfillment of his dream, the flowering of his ambition. It was beauty, wealth, and wonder woven together into a tapestry unlike any the world had seen before. It was the moment when the city stood at its height, when the king believed he had conquered both time and fate. But like all golden ages, it was not eternal. Splendor shines brightest just before the shadow falls. Splendor dazzles the eyes, but shadows always gather where the light burns brightest. The golden age of the city did not end in a sudden crash. It began to fray slowly, quietly, like threads loosening at the edges of a magnificent tapestry. To the common eye, the city still gleamed, but beneath the marble floors and golden roofs, tension stirred. The king had built his dream with iron determination, but his hunger for more glory had not faded. Though his city already stood as the envy of nations, he demanded greater monuments, higher walls, richer festivals, and ever grander processions. To achieve this, he turned to his people, demanding heavier taxes, longer hours of labor, and stricter obedience. At first, they complied, still caught in the glow of his vision. But as years passed, the weight began to press upon their backs. In the bustling markets, where once laughter had rung freely, conversations turned cautious. Merchants grumbled about the endless levies on their trade. Farmers, weary from giving too much of their harvest to fill the granaries, whispered of hunger creeping into their homes. Craftsmen, who had once taken pride in building fountains and temples, now found themselves pressed into labor for projects that never seemed to end. Slowly, discontent seeped through the city like water through cracked stone. The nobles, too, began to stir. Once, they had stood proudly at the king's side, their loyalty rewarded with wealth and power. But as his dominance grew, their influence waned. He claimed victories as his alone, reduced their voices in council, and made them bow deeper at his throne. They masked their resentment with smiles, but behind closed doors, whispers grew sharper. Alliances formed in the dark, bound not by friendship but by shared frustration. And yet, in the grand festivals, these shadows remained hidden. When torches lit the streets and drums echoed through the night, the people cheered as though nothing were amiss. They wore their joy like masks, convincing themselves that their struggles were worth it, that their sacrifices were noble, that their king was still the chosen ruler destined for eternity. But when the music faded, and the streets fell silent, unease lingered in the air. The temples reflected this change as well. Priests had once spoken with certainty, declaring the gods' blessing upon the city. But now their voices wavered. Some whispered that the gods were displeased with the king's pride, that his hunger for glory had grown too great, that he was no longer building for the divine but for his own immortality. Rumors spread that sacrifices no longer satisfied, that omens in the stars warned of imbalance. Though the king dismissed these words as superstition, the people carried them in their hearts. Fear crept where once there had been only devotion. Inside the palace, the king felt the unease, though he did not admit it. His nights grew restless. He dreamed of shadows stretching across his city, of voices rising against him, of walls cracking under invisible weight. But in the morning, he pushed such fears aside. He would not allow weakness to touch his reign. Instead, he doubled his efforts, commanding more building, more soldiers, more displays of power. To him, the answer to doubt was always greater splendor. But marble cannot hide every crack. The soldiers, once proud and loyal, grew weary as well. They watched their families struggle under the burden of taxes while they guarded parades and construction sites. Their loyalty remained, but it was no longer unshakable. Some wondered if their swords served the city or merely the king's ambition. The first signs of rebellion did not come in fire or battle, but in silence. Workers delayed their tasks. Farmers withheld portions of their harvest. Merchants avoided paying full tribute, hiding profits in secret. The nobles turned their feasts into quiet councils, speaking of the future in voices too low for the king's spies to hear. The city still glittered, but its heartbeat was uneven, no longer steady, no longer certain. The king sensed it. He walked through the gardens of his palace, gazing at the fountains and flowers, and he felt the beauty slipping from his grasp. He summoned his advisors, demanded answers, punished those he deemed disloyal. Yet the more he tried to control, the more resistance grew. Fear spread faster than faith. The people who once adored him now watched with wary eyes. Still, in the great ceremonies, he stood tall. He dressed in gold, wore his crown high, and held himself as though nothing could touch him. To the watching world, he remained the magnificent ruler of the greatest city on earth. But behind the marble walls, he knew the truth. He had built splendor upon obedience, and obedience was beginning to crumble. The city, once united by pride, was now divided by doubt. The king, once lifted by his people's devotion, was now weighed down by their unrest. The golden age had not ended, but its light had dimmed. Beneath the marble floors, beneath the painted ceilings, beneath the chants and festivals, shadows stretched longer with each passing day. This was the turning point. The city still stood, glorious to the outside eye, but within, its foundation had begun to weaken. The king still believed himself eternal, but history was already moving, slow and quiet, toward a fall that he could not see. Shadows beneath marble do not stay hidden forever. They grow, they spread, and one day, they break through. Even the grandest city, built with marble and gold, cannot exist in isolation. Beyond its fortified walls, the world waits, a world of rival kingdoms, cunning neighbors, and restless ambitions. Though the king's city gleamed like a jewel in the sun, its brilliance drew envy and hostility. As long as the city stood, it would be a target, and its ruler, however powerful, would face threats from every direction. The golden age of prosperity, for all its beauty, was shadowed by danger just beyond the gates. The first signs of threat were subtle. Scouts returned with reports of unusual movements along the borders. Traders whispered about armies gathering quietly, hiding under the cover of night, their numbers growing beyond what could be explained by simple preparation. Envoys arrived bearing smiles that did not reach their eyes, offering treaties that seemed generous but were laced with subtle threats. The king, proud and confident, initially dismissed these warnings, believing that no enemy could challenge his dominion. Yet even as he stood on the palace balconies, gazing at the horizon, the tension in the air was palpable. Rivals across the land watched the city's prosperity with growing resentment. Neighboring kings, once content to trade or ally, now feared being overshadowed by a power too bright to ignore. They sent spies to study its walls, scholars to record its markets, and warriors to observe its armies. Every detail of the city, from its architecture to its grain stores, was catalogued, measured, and plotted. These were not idle acts of curiosity, they were the quiet steps of those preparing to strike, to challenge what they could not build themselves. The king, however, was not blind to the world beyond his walls. He had fought his way to power, and he understood strategy. Armies were raised, fortifications strengthened, and patrols doubled. Messengers carried orders across distant territories, instructing governors and generals to remain vigilant. The city's gates were reinforced, and the walls, already imposing, were expanded in places where scouts predicted vulnerabilities. Soldiers trained tirelessly, drilling for attacks that might never come, preparing for battles that could decide the fate of the entire kingdom. Still, threats were more than armies or swords. Diplomacy, too, became a weapon, wielded with subtlety and danger. Alliances that seemed friendly were tested with impossible demands. Marriages proposed in kindness were layered with obligations designed to weaken. Envoys delivered messages written with double meanings, carefully crafted to suggest cooperation while implying consequences for refusal. The king navigated these carefully, his sharp mind interpreting hidden meanings, countering subtle threats with subtle strategies of his own. But even the sharpest mind cannot eliminate all risk. In the city, murmurs of unease grew. Citizens and soldiers alike sensed the growing tension. Merchants who had once brought exotic goods freely now eyed passing traders with suspicion, wondering if spies had crept among them. Craftsmen whispered about resources being redirected to fortifications rather than art. Even the priests, who had long proclaimed divine favor, spoke quietly of omens and portents, of stars misaligned and shadows lengthening. The city that seemed unshakable now felt the stirrings of fear, like a forest stirred by a distant wind. Enemies did not reveal themselves all at once. Threats appeared as whispers, as shadows at the edge of the gates, as spies walking among citizens. Some nights, torches flickered across the distant hills, silhouettes of figures testing the city's vigilance. Other nights, silent riders carried messages from unknown hands, declaring fealty to one faction, warning another, spreading uncertainty with every line of ink. The king realized that danger was not only measured in swords or siege engines but in cunning and calculation, in the slow erosion of trust and the quiet manipulation of fear. As the external threats multiplied, the king's anxiety deepened. Though he remained calm in public, in private chambers he walked endlessly, thinking through every possible scenario. Maps were spread across tables, showing roads, rivers, and borders. Generals spoke in hushed tones, calculating supplies, troop rotations, and strategies for defense. Advisors debated endlessly, proposing both preemptive attacks and cautious negotiations. Yet no plan could fully contain the unknown. For every enemy identified, another waited unseen, testing, probing, watching, learning. The city itself, a marvel of engineering and wealth, became both shield and vulnerability. Its towering walls were formidable, but the vast gates, necessary for trade and communication, were points of risk. Its markets overflowed with prosperity, but prosperity could invite sabotage. Even its temples, symbols of divine favor, were targets for those who sought to undermine the king's claim to legitimacy. The very elements that made the city glorious also made it fragile, a jewel under constant scrutiny. Still, the king remained resolute. He summoned his council, his generals, his spies, and all who served him with loyalty. Each was given a task, a mission, a responsibility to secure the city. Patrols were increased along the outer walls, watchtowers manned at all hours, and scouts sent far beyond the borders to detect movements before they became threats. Yet even as he commanded, he felt the weight of vigilance pressing against him. Every decision carried consequences, every delay a potential disaster, every miscalculation a possible death for thousands. Even the grandest city, built with marble and gold, cannot exist in isolation. Beyond its fortified walls, the world waits, a world of rival kingdoms, cunning neighbors, and restless ambitions. Though the king's city gleamed like a jewel in the sun, its brilliance drew envy and hostility. As long as the city stood, it would be a target, and its ruler, however powerful, would face threats from every direction. The golden age of prosperity, for all its beauty, was shadowed by danger just beyond the gates. The first signs of threat were subtle. Scouts returned with reports of unusual movements along the borders. Traders whispered about armies gathering quietly, hiding under the cover of night, their numbers growing beyond what could be explained by simple preparation. Envoys arrived bearing smiles that did not reach their eyes, offering treaties that seemed generous but were laced with subtle threats. The king, proud and confident, initially dismissed these warnings, believing that no enemy could challenge his dominion. Yet even as he stood on the palace balconies, gazing at the horizon, the tension in the air was palpable. Rivals across the land watched the city's prosperity with growing resentment. Neighboring kings, once content to trade or ally, now feared being overshadowed by a power too bright to ignore. They sent spies to study its walls, scholars to record its markets, and warriors to observe its armies. Every detail of the city, from its architecture to its grain stores, was catalogued, measured, and plotted. These were not idle acts of curiosity, they were the quiet steps of those preparing to strike, to challenge what they could not build themselves. The king, however, was not blind to the world beyond his walls. He had fought his way to power, and he understood strategy. Armies were raised, fortifications strengthened, and patrols doubled. Messengers carried orders across distant territories, instructing governors and generals to remain vigilant. The city's gates were reinforced, and the walls, already imposing, were expanded in places where scouts predicted vulnerabilities. Soldiers trained tirelessly, drilling for attacks that might never come, preparing for battles that could decide the fate of the entire kingdom. Still, threats were more than armies or swords. Diplomacy, too, became a weapon, wielded with subtlety and danger. Alliances that seemed friendly were tested with impossible demands. Marriages proposed in kindness were layered with obligations designed to weaken. Envoys delivered messages written with double meanings, carefully crafted to suggest cooperation while implying consequences for refusal. The king navigated these carefully, his sharp mind interpreting hidden meanings, countering subtle threats with subtle strategies of his own. But even the sharpest mind cannot eliminate all risk. In the city, murmurs of unease grew. Citizens and soldiers alike sensed the growing tension. Merchants who had once brought exotic goods freely now eyed passing traders with suspicion, wondering if spies had crept among them. Craftsmen whispered about resources being redirected to fortifications rather than art. Even the priests, who had long proclaimed divine favor, spoke quietly of omens and portents, of stars misaligned and shadows lengthening. The city that seemed unshakable now felt the stirrings of fear, like a forest stirred by a distant wind. Enemies did not reveal themselves all at once. Threats appeared as whispers, as shadows at the edge of the gates, as spies walking among citizens. Some nights, torches flickered across the distant hills, silhouettes of figures testing the city's vigilance. Other nights, silent riders carried messages from unknown hands, declaring fealty to one faction, warning another, spreading uncertainty with every line of ink. The king realized that danger was not only measured in swords or siege engines but in cunning and calculation, in the slow erosion of trust and the quiet manipulation of fear. As the external threats multiplied, the king's anxiety deepened. Though he remained calm in public, in private chambers he walked endlessly, thinking through every possible scenario. Maps were spread across tables, showing roads, rivers, and borders. Generals spoke in hushed tones, calculating supplies, troop rotations, and strategies for defense. Advisors debated endlessly, proposing both preemptive attacks and cautious negotiations. Yet no plan could fully contain the unknown. For every enemy identified, another waited unseen, testing, probing, watching, learning. The city itself, a marvel of engineering and wealth, became both shield and vulnerability. Its towering walls were formidable, but the vast gates, necessary for trade and communication, were points of risk. Its markets overflowed with prosperity, but prosperity could invite sabotage. Even its temples, symbols of divine favor, were targets for those who sought to undermine the king's claim to legitimacy. The very elements that made the city glorious also made it fragile, a jewel under constant scrutiny. Still, the king remained resolute. He summoned his council, his generals, his spies, and all who served him with loyalty. Each was given a task, a mission, a responsibility to secure the city. Patrols were increased along the outer walls, watchtowers manned at all hours, and scouts sent far beyond the borders to detect movements before they became threats. Yet even as he commanded, he felt the weight of vigilance pressing against him. Every decision carried consequences, every delay a potential disaster, every miscalculation a possible death for thousands. Power can be intoxicating. Ambition can be blinding. And for a king who had risen from nothing to command one of the greatest cities the world had ever known, the line between pride and obsession is easily crossed. In the years following his city's golden age, the ruler became consumed by an idea, a need to protect, control, and perfect his creation at all costs. What began as careful vigilance slowly mutated into an obsession that would shape not only his actions but the destiny of every citizen within the walls. At first, it was subtle. He began inspecting every project personally, walking through markets and workshops, scrutinizing merchants and artisans for flaws that others overlooked. Architects were called to explain even the smallest design choices, soldiers to justify every tactic and patrol. Nothing escaped his gaze, and nothing seemed too small for his attention. The city, once alive with ease and rhythm, now pulsed under the shadow of his scrutiny. Workers whispered of the king's presence before a wall was finished, fearing both praise and punishment in equal measure. The obsession grew. No structure was complete until he had examined it, no festival approved until it met his exacting standards. He demanded not only perfection but absolute loyalty, an unquestioning obedience that few could provide consistently. His mind became consumed with what he perceived as potential threats, not only outside the walls, where enemies waited, but inside, where ambition or weakness might take root in the hearts of those he trusted. Even the smallest perceived betrayal, real or imagined, was met with swift consequences. As his obsession intensified, it began to transform his perception of the city itself. What he had once seen as a monument of achievement became, in his eyes, a fragile vessel that must be constantly safeguarded. Streets were patrolled more frequently, watchtowers were reinforced, and the gates were inspected with a meticulousness bordering on mania. He believed that the smallest lapse could unravel decades of careful construction, that a single act of defiance might trigger chaos. His vigilance became unrelenting, and those around him could sense both the brilliance and the peril in his mind. This obsession also shaped his relationship with the people. Where once they had been inspired by his vision, now they felt the weight of his intensity. Merchants feared delays or inspections, soldiers feared scrutiny and the consequences of misjudgment, nobles feared that any disagreement, no matter how small, could provoke the king's wrath. The Golden Age, once a time of pride and wonder, had begun to feel like a gilded cage, the brilliance of the city overshadowed by the shadows cast by the king's unyielding gaze. The king's obsession was not only with control but with immortality. He could not bear the thought that his city, his crowning achievement, might outlast him only to fall into disrepair, betrayal, or conquest. Every festival, every monument, every law he imposed was imbued with his desire for permanence. And yet, paradoxically, the more he sought to preserve, the more precarious his hold became. History had taught him that greatness attracts envy, and envy, in turn, sows destruction. His obsession was both shield and burden, protecting the city while straining the very foundation of loyalty and trust. Those closest to him recognized the danger, though few dared to speak openly. Advisors whispered behind closed doors about the king's relentless focus, about the toll it took on both mind and body. Generals warned that his insistence on perfection slowed response times and drained resources. Yet the king ignored these cautions, convinced that only through absolute control could his dream remain untarnished. In his mind, there was no room for doubt, no margin for imperfection. Every moment spent outside his supervision felt like a risk to the city's survival. The obsession extended even to the perception of time. The king measured his days in milestones of achievement, the completion of a gate, the raising of a temple, the training of soldiers. Nights were spent reviewing plans, poring over maps, and imagining scenarios of attack, rebellion, or disaster. Sleep became a luxury, and even when he rested, dreams were filled with visions of his city, both glowing in triumph and trembling on the edge of ruin. His mind was a constant calculus, balancing ambition, fear, and desire, rarely granting him peace. And yet, this obsession was not without its human appeal. It was, in many ways, a reflection of his devotion. The city was his creation, and like a parent watching a child, he could not ignore its vulnerabilities. He cared deeply, perhaps more than any mortal had cared for a city before. Every inspection, every decree, every meticulous review was motivated by the desire to protect, to perfect, to ensure that his vision would endure. But passion, when unchecked, can become destructive. The very care he gave to the city was the seed of the fear and mistrust that would later shape its fate. Paradoxically, the obsession heightened his brilliance even as it planted the seeds of downfall. Military strategies became more intricate, architectural designs more elaborate, and laws more precise. Every plan, every festival, every building project bore the mark of a mind unwilling to compromise. Yet brilliance without balance is fragile, and the city, magnificent as it was, began to feel the strain of one man's unyielding focus. The very people who sustained the city began to feel it as pressure, as unease, as tension beneath the surface of daily life. The obsession also revealed itself in his relationships. Friends became cautious, lovers wary, allies vigilant. The king's need for control extended beyond the city walls into the hearts and minds of those around him. Trust, once freely given, now required constant proof. Every gesture, every word, every action was measured against an unseen standard. Some began to resent his intensity, others feared it, a few were drawn to it, awed by the combination of brilliance and intensity. Yet the king remained largely alone, for obsession often isolates even as it inspires. Historians would later write that the king's obsession was both his greatest strength and his most dangerous flaw. It allowed him to maintain order in a city that could easily have unraveled under its own wealth and ambition. It ensured that no detail was overlooked, that no vulnerability was ignored. Yet it also fostered fear, anxiety, and mistrust, turning citizens and nobles alike into hesitant participants in a dream that had begun to feel heavier with each passing year. As the years wore on, the obsession deepened, and the king's mind became increasingly entwined with the fate of the city. It was no longer merely a place to rule, but an extension of his identity. The city's walls were his armor, its streets his veins, its temples his heart. Every shadow, every whisper, every flicker of unrest felt like a threat not just to the city but to himself. In trying to safeguard his creation, he began to see danger in every corner, paranoia creeping like smoke through his mind. The fatal nature of this obsession is clear when viewed in hindsight. It drove him to unparalleled achievements, but it also sowed the seeds of fear and mistrust that would later shape decisions leading to ruin. It transformed vigilance into paranoia, devotion into tyranny, and caution into a prelude to destruction. In his quest to perfect, he overlooked the fragile humanity of those who built the city alongside him, those whose loyalty, when strained too far, might bend and eventually break. And so the king's obsession became the lens through which every event, every interaction, every whisper was filtered. What he saw as threats were sometimes shadows of imagination. What he perceived as disloyalty was sometimes simple fear or fatigue. Yet the obsession did not allow nuance. It demanded certainty, control, and absolute adherence to his vision. It was a double-edged sword. It maintained the city's splendor even as it pushed it closer to the precipice of tragedy. In this way, the king's obsession was both guardian and harbinger. It preserved the Golden Age, even as it created the conditions for the eventual fire. His brilliance and his fear became inseparable, shaping decisions that would ultimately decide the city's fate. History would remember him not only as a creator but as a man whose passion and obsession intertwined in ways that no mortal could fully control. The fatal obsession was complete. It consumed him in thought, action, and will, and it reached outward into the lives of every citizen, shaping the rhythm of the city itself. The stage was set. The Golden Age still glimmered, but the first shadows of impending tragedy had been cast. And in the quiet of the palace, as torches flickered and the city hummed beneath his gaze, the king's mind began to turn toward decisions that no dream, however brilliant, could fully contain. Even the strongest walls cannot hold back the inevitability of fate. The Golden City, radiant in the sunlight, magnificent in its wealth and architecture, was slowly approaching a night that would change everything. It was a night the king both feared and, in secret, contemplated, a night where fire and consequence would converge, shaping the destiny of all who lived within the walls. The whispers of unrest, the shadows of envy, and the threads of obsession had been weaving together for years. Now, they were poised to ignite. The day had begun as any other. Markets overflowed with goods, artisans honed their craft, and children ran through wide avenues, their laughter echoing off marble walls. Soldiers marched in training, their armor gleaming, swords sharp, and eyes vigilant. Priests chanted in temples, offering prayers for the city's continued prosperity and protection. To an observer, it appeared as though the city were in perfect harmony, its golden age continuing unbroken. Yet beneath the surface, tension simmered, quiet but undeniable, like the low rumble of distant thunder. The king moved through the streets with a measured pace, observing every detail. He watched merchants exchange goods, scrutinized soldiers on patrol, and listened to whispers from the common people with a keen ear. He saw the cracks forming in loyalty, the fatigue in the eyes of those who served him, and the subtle signs of resentment. Yet, in his mind, all these threads were manageable, all these shadows controllable. He believed that careful planning and decisive action could maintain order, that his obsession and vigilance would safeguard the city from the storm he sensed approaching. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky with shades of crimson and gold, the first signs of unusual activity appeared along the outer walls. Scouts reported movements across the hills, shadows shifting in ways that did not align with routine patrols. Caravans from neighboring territories arrived later than expected, their travelers weary and tight-lipped, hinting at disturbances in their homelands. Envoys brought messages with subtle threats, reminding the king that no power, however great, could exist unchallenged. The Golden City was no longer simply admired, it was watched, measured, and desired by forces outside its gates. Inside the city, the king's advisors whispered in quiet chambers, debating the best course of action. Some urged caution, others advocated preemptive strikes, and still others counseled negotiation. The king, however, had already begun to plan something far bolder. His mind, sharpened by years of vigilance and obsession, began to conceive a strategy that was both brilliant and terrifying. A plan that, if executed, could preserve his legacy and control, but at a cost so great that few dared imagine it. As night fell, torches lit the streets and cast flickering shadows across marble walls. The city appeared tranquil, peaceful, as if nothing had changed from the golden days. But the air was charged with unease. Servants hurried along corridors, nobles whispered behind closed doors, and soldiers tightened their grips on weapons, sensing a tension they could not name. Even the citizens, unaware of the king's thoughts, felt the subtle shift, an instinctive recognition that the night held a significance unlike any before. The king's obsession, now intertwined with the approaching crisis, guided his actions. He called for the council of generals, the most trusted advisors, and the chief engineers. Maps were unrolled across tables, walls inspected, and every strategic position re-evaluated. But the calculations of man are limited, and the calculations of a mind consumed by obsession can be distorted. The king saw threats everywhere, even as he overlooked the unpredictable nature of human emotion. His obsession, so long a source of control, now hinted at catastrophe. Outside the city, rival forces moved with precision. Armies, spies, and mercenaries approached from multiple directions, some seeking to exploit perceived weaknesses, others simply observing, waiting for the perfect moment. The king was aware of many of these movements, yet the true scale of the threat remained obscured by secrecy, by the unknown, and by the complexity of human ambition. The city, despite its grandeur and defenses, was vulnerable in ways that stone and gold could not shield. Inside the walls, life continued, but unease hung like a thin fog over every corner. Citizens spoke less loudly in markets, children were brought indoors earlier than usual, and the usual rhythm of the city's festivals slowed to a cautious pace. Even the priests sensed a dissonance in the air, their chants tinged with subtle notes of apprehension. The Golden City, though outwardly shining, carried the weight of anticipation, a tension that mirrored the rising smoke on the horizon of what was to come. The king's obsession, once a source of pride, now guided decisions that would shape the night ahead. He inspected granaries, ensuring supplies for both citizens and soldiers. He checked the city's walls, reinforcing gates and reviewing patrol rotations. He even visited temples, offering prayers of protection and making ceremonial gestures to demonstrate faith and inspire confidence. But beneath each action was a mind driven by the recognition that nothing, not even his brilliance, could fully secure the city against all threats. As darkness deepened, the first whispers of smoke appeared at the edges of the horizon. Scouts returned with reports of fires in distant villages, of armies preparing under the cover of night, and of movement that hinted at imminent conflict. The city's pulse quickened. Soldiers were summoned to their posts, gates were locked and checked repeatedly, and citizens were advised to remain calm. The golden glow of torches and lanterns illuminated a city poised between tranquility and catastrophe, a city holding its breath as the night approached. Night had fallen completely, and with it, a heavy stillness settled over the city. The golden glow of its walls, which had once symbolized safety, wealth, and triumph, now stood as a fragile barrier against the approaching calamity. Beyond the gates, fires burned in distant villages, smoke curling into the sky, visible even from the city's highest towers. The king, ever vigilant, had anticipated danger, yet nothing could fully prepare a city, or its people, for the moment when chaos would descend. The first flames appeared like the faintest flicker on the horizon, almost imperceptible at first, but growing steadily. Scouts returned in urgent waves, reporting columns of fire, the crackle of torches, and the march of enemy soldiers approaching from multiple directions. Panic did not erupt immediately. The people had grown accustomed to festivals, torchlit celebrations, and the golden glow of nightly city lights. But as the flickers became brighter and the smoke thicker, the hum of routine transformed into a whisper of dread. Inside the palace, the king moved swiftly. His mind, sharp from years of obsession and vigilance, worked tirelessly to assess the situation. Soldiers were deployed to strategic locations, gates were reinforced, and citizens were instructed to take shelter. His generals, seasoned in battle, strategized for defense, attempting to hold the city together even as the perimeter threatened to break. Yet, despite meticulous preparation, the scale of the threat was unlike anything the city had faced before. Flames were no longer distant, they were closing in, consuming villages and forests, and threatening to overwhelm the city's defenses. The people of the city felt the change acutely. Merchants shuttered their shops, hurrying to secure valuables and loved ones. Craftsmen abandoned their workshops mid-task, rushing home to gather family and possessions. Children were hurried indoors, their laughter replaced with questions and fear. Even the nobles, dressed in finery just hours before, now moved with purpose and anxiety, aware that the golden age they had cherished was teetering on the edge of annihilation. Every street, every market, every square became a stage for preparation, for tension, for the silent acknowledgement that the familiar world was about to be engulfed. As the fires grew nearer, the city's defenses were tested. Soldiers manned the walls, their spears and shields glinting in torchlight. Archers took positions atop towers, ready to repel invaders. Watchtowers blazed with signal fires to alert neighboring districts, and patrolling units moved like shadows through alleys and courtyards. The king himself walked among them, offering calm commands, adjusting strategy, and observing every detail. Though he exuded authority, the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him. He understood that the safety of tens of thousands depended on decisions made in mere moments. The enemy did not attack all at once. They advanced methodically, exploiting weaknesses, testing defenses, probing for openings. Fires set in surrounding villages spread with terrifying speed, aided by wind that carried sparks toward the city walls. Smoke crept into streets and homes, stinging eyes and lungs, adding confusion to fear. In the chaos, the city's order began to unravel. Even the most disciplined soldiers had to navigate streets choked with smoke, people rushing for safety, and structures vulnerable to both fire and siege. The king's obsession, once a tool of brilliance, now complicated matters. Every wall had to be inspected, every gate reinforced, every tactical position reassessed. His need for perfection slowed certain decisions even as it ensured that other aspects of defense were flawless. In his mind, the city was both an extension of himself and a fragile jewel to be protected at any cost. Every decision, whether to save a district, fortify a wall, or order a tactical retreat, was calculated with precision, yet tinged with the inevitable uncertainty of human life. As the night deepened, the flames reached the outskirts of the city. Wooden structures, gates, and watchtowers ignited, sending sparks into the air like showers of falling stars. Citizens screamed in terror, gathering loved ones and valuables, while others froze, unable to comprehend the speed and intensity of the destruction. Soldiers fought bravely, their swords clashing against the intruders, arrows piercing the smoke-filled sky. Yet, despite courage and strategy, the fire moved relentlessly, consuming structures and threatening to consume the spirit of the city itself. The palace, symbol of the king's vision and ambition, became a focal point. Torches reflected off marble floors and gilded ceilings as the king moved from chamber to chamber, directing troops, ensuring evacuation routes, and maintaining lines of communication. He witnessed both heroism and tragedy, citizens sacrificing themselves to save neighbors, soldiers falling in defense of walls, and buildings, temples, markets, homes, succumbing to flames. Every sight was a reminder of the fragility of human effort, of how quickly order can dissolve into chaos. Smoke thickened, swirling through streets and halls, forcing citizens to cover mouths and eyes. The air was heavy with the scent of burning wood, plaster, and cloth. Sounds of alarm bells, shouted orders, and screams created a symphony of panic. Even in this chaos, some sought courage in ritual. Priests led prayers in temples, citizens lit candles as offerings, and families clung to one another, finding brief solace in unity amidst devastation. Yet, the relentless advance of fire spared no one, ignoring wealth, status, or loyalty. The king faced impossible choices. Which districts to save, which to abandon, which troops to commit, which to preserve. Each decision carried life or death consequences. Even the mightiest wall could be breached, even the strongest gate could be set aflame. The city's order, so carefully maintained for decades, was dissolving into a sequence of crises. His obsession, which had once ensured perfection, now collided with the unpredictable nature of both human courage and error. The balance between life and destruction, control and chaos, hung by the thinnest of threads. In the streets, chaos intertwined with bravery. Citizens formed human chains to move buckets of water toward flames, soldiers charged into burning buildings to rescue trapped families, and neighbors guided each other through smoke-choked alleyways. Yet the fire was not merely a physical force, it became a psychological one. Fear, panic, and desperation spread faster than the flames themselves. The city, despite years of preparation and careful planning, faced the merciless unpredictability of disaster. Even the king's obsession could not halt nature's role in destruction. Wind carried sparks into previously untouched districts, igniting rooftops and wooden walkways. Smoke obscured lines of sight, disrupting coordination and communication. Streets once wide and orderly became mazes of debris and frightened citizens, slowing the movement of both soldiers and supplies. The city's defenses, formidable in design, were being tested to their limits. And yet, amidst the devastation, moments of courage and human resilience shone like fragile stars against the consuming darkness. As hours passed, the flames crept closer to the heart of the city. Towers burned, temples crumbled, and markets vanished in a haze of smoke and fire. Citizens were driven into panic, fleeing in every direction, seeking refuge wherever possible. Soldiers continued their defense, fighting with exhaustion and desperation, knowing that the weight of the city's fate rested on their shoulders. The king, observing from the palace, felt the full measure of his obsession, ambition, and responsibility converging into a moment of ultimate judgment. In the midst of destruction, the king made a fateful decision. He recognized that some parts of the city could not be saved without sacrificing even greater areas. To protect what he valued most, he ordered controlled burns in specific districts, a calculated strategy to contain the spread, even at the cost of lives and structures. This act, a blend of brilliance and tragedy, revealed the depth of his obsession. He would preserve the vision of the city, even if it meant sacrificing those who had built it alongside him. By the time the first light of dawn approached, the city was a landscape of smoke, flames, and embers. Towers had collapsed, gates were charred, and streets once teeming with life were littered with debris. The citizens, survivors, and casualties alike, emerged from hiding, witnessing the full scope of devastation. The Golden City, once the pinnacle of ambition and human achievement, had been transformed into a tableau of destruction, firelight reflecting off the few remaining walls, a stark reminder of both the brilliance and fragility of human creation. The king stood amid the ruins, surveying the aftermath of the night of fire. His mind, still sharp with obsession, calculated losses, assessed what remained, and considered the future of a city that had been simultaneously his greatest triumph and his most devastating responsibility. He understood, as few men ever do, that creation and destruction are inseparably entwined, that the heights of ambition are measured not only by achievement but by the consequences when the forces of fate converge. The morning sun rose slowly over the city, casting pale light over streets still heavy with smoke and debris. The Golden City, once vibrant with life, was now scarred, its marble walls blackened, its towers broken, its markets empty. Yet in the silence that followed the inferno, there was a strange sense of possibility, as if the ashes themselves held seeds of renewal. The fire had consumed not only buildings but also pride, obsession, and fear, leaving behind the raw foundation for something entirely new. Survivors emerged cautiously, stepping over charred beams and crumbled walls. Their faces bore expressions of grief, exhaustion, and disbelief, but also flickers of determination. Families reunited, embracing through tears, their hands still blackened with soot. Neighbors helped each other remove debris, searching for belongings, water, and remnants of their former lives. The city, despite the devastation, stirred with the first signs of resilience. Even amidst ruin, life persisted, and with life came the opportunity to rebuild. The king, weary but unbroken, walked through the streets alongside his generals and advisors. His eyes took in every detail, cataloguing the destruction and assessing what could be salvaged. Unlike the night before, when obsession had driven every decision, now a more reflective clarity guided him. He understood that rebuilding would require not just strength and strategy, but patience, humility, and trust in the people who had endured alongside him. The city was no longer a perfect jewel under his sole command. It was a living, breathing organism, capable of renewal if tended carefully. Citizens began the work of clearing streets and restoring essential functions. Water wells were cleaned, temporary shelters erected, and basic supplies distributed. Artisans salvaged what they could, preparing to reconstruct homes, markets, and workshops. Soldiers assisted not with swords and shields, but with labor and organization, guiding citizens safely through unstable streets and ensuring that critical structures were stabilized. Even in this moment of loss, the city's heartbeat resumed, slower perhaps, but persistent, a testament to human resilience and determination. The king addressed his people from the central square, his voice calm yet firm, carrying across the open air. He spoke not as a ruler demanding obedience, but as one acknowledging shared loss and shared responsibility. He praised their courage, recognized their grief, and laid out plans for reconstruction. He urged patience and unity, emphasizing that the city's survival depended not solely on walls or towers, but on the loyalty, cooperation, and vision of every citizen. In that moment, the people felt a rekindling of hope, inspired by the steady presence of the king who had endured the same loss. Rebuilding was both a practical and symbolic endeavor. Marble and stone were gathered, charred wood replaced with stronger timbers, and streets realigned to improve both beauty and function. Temples, once reduced to rubble, were reconstructed with care, incorporating lessons from the disaster. Soldiers and artisans worked side by side, demonstrating that the distinctions of rank were less important than the shared goal of restoring life and order. The city, while scarred, began to reclaim its splendor, its rebirth a testament to determination and collaboration. The king's obsession, tempered by the lessons of fire, evolved into a guiding force for reconstruction. No longer was it solely a drive for perfection or control, it became a vision of sustainable renewal. Policies were adjusted to ease burdens on citizens, taxes moderated, and labor distributed more equitably. Strategic fortifications were strengthened, but always with an eye toward balance, protection without suffocation, vigilance without paranoia. The mistakes of the past, burned into the city by fire, informed every new decision, shaping a future that sought harmony alongside grandeur. Communities, previously divided by social class or ambition, began to unite in purpose. Markets reopened gradually, with merchants cooperating to ensure supply and fairness. Families rebuilt homes together, neighbors sharing materials and labor. Festivals resumed, quieter at first, but gradually regaining the rhythm of celebration and pride. Even the youngest citizens, children who had witnessed terror and loss, participated, learning lessons of resilience, cooperation, and the cyclical nature of creation and destruction. The city, though forever marked by fire, was alive with hope and determination. Temples became centers not only of worship but of guidance. Priests incorporated teachings about perseverance, renewal, and humility, emphasizing that prosperity is never guaranteed and that vigilance must be balanced with compassion. Citizens turned to these spaces for solace and inspiration, learning that the human spirit, like the city itself, could endure even the most overwhelming challenges. Faith, once shaken by catastrophe, regained strength through the shared efforts of survival and reconstruction. The king oversaw every stage of rebuilding personally, not as a dictator imposing will, but as a guide fostering collaboration. He walked among citizens, listened to their concerns, and offered encouragement and counsel. His obsession, once a source of tension and fear, now manifested as dedication and empathy, motivating others to invest in the city's future. The Golden Age had been tested by fire, but the rebirth was shaping a city that could endure not only walls and towers, but also human frailty, ambition, and resilience. In the weeks and months that followed, the city slowly regained its former glory. Streets, once blackened with soot, were cleaned and repaved. Markets reopened fully, artisans crafted new works of beauty, and children's laughter once again echoed off restored walls. Soldiers trained diligently, not only in defense but in coordination with citizens, demonstrating a new model of mutual responsibility. Every brick laid, every tower rebuilt, every festival celebrated was a testament to the resilience of a people who had faced fire and refused to be consumed by it. The king reflected often on the lessons of the inferno. He recognized that his obsession, while responsible for brilliance, had also contributed to vulnerability. He vowed to temper ambition with empathy, vigilance with trust, and control with shared responsibility. The fire had been a brutal teacher, but the ashes offered clarity, perspective, and the chance to rebuild stronger, wiser, and more united than before. In this way, the rebirth was not just physical, but also spiritual, political, and cultural. Even as reconstruction continued, stories of heroism, courage, and selflessness circulated throughout the city. Families who had saved neighbors from burning homes were honored, soldiers who had risked lives to protect civilians were celebrated, citizens who had worked tirelessly in the aftermath were acknowledged for their contributions. These narratives, shared around hearths, marketplaces, and temples, created a collective memory that reinforced unity, pride, and resilience, ensuring that the lessons of fire would endure alongside the reconstructed marble and stone. The city, though forever bearing the scars of the inferno, emerged with a new identity. No longer was it merely a symbol of grandeur, obsession, and ambition. It had become a living testament to human perseverance, cooperation, and renewal. The king, once consumed by obsession, now channeled his energy into guidance, inspiration, and stewardship. The Golden Age, though tested, was not extinguished. It had transformed, becoming richer in wisdom, humility, and collective strength. In time, the city regained its prominence. Travelers marveled not only at its beauty but at the story of its rebirth. Neighboring kingdoms, previously envious, now regarded it with respect, understanding that true power lies not only in walls and wealth, but in resilience and unity. The king's legacy evolved as well, remembered not solely for obsession or ambition, but for the wisdom to rebuild, the courage to face devastation, and the vision to transform tragedy into a foundation for enduring greatness. Thus, from the ashes of fire, the city rose anew. Its streets, temples, and walls bore the marks of destruction, but also of hope. Its citizens, having endured fear, loss, and chaos, learned the value of cooperation, courage, and resilience. And the king, forever shaped by his past, became not only a ruler but a guide, a witness to the delicate balance between brilliance and humility, ambition and wisdom, destruction and rebirth. The Golden City lived on, a testament to the enduring spirit of humanity. In the aftermath of fire, as the city slowly rose from its ashes, the people and their king began to reflect on the profound lessons etched not only in marble and timber but in their very lives. The destruction had revealed truths that no celebrations, victories, or architectural wonders could convey. Vulnerability, resilience, and wisdom were now tangible, inscribed in every charred wall, every rebuilt home, and every cautious but hopeful glance exchanged between neighbors. It was a moment for reflection, for understanding that greatness is never guaranteed, and that even the most magnificent city is fragile if its foundation, human and material, is ignored. The king, once consumed by obsession, now walked through the streets with a tempered vision. His eyes, previously searching for flaws, now sought understanding, empathy, and insight. Each encounter with citizens offered a new lesson: the value of trust, the necessity of patience, the strength that emerges when people act in unity. Soldiers shared stories of bravery, families recounted sacrifices, and artisans revealed the delicate balance between pride and humility in their work. Every story, every observation, became a guide, a blueprint for governance and human connection that could not be found in maps or military manuals. The lessons were often harsh, etched in blood, sweat, and ash. The fire had punished hubris, rewarded courage, and revealed the true cost of obsession. It demonstrated that no ruler, regardless of skill or intellect, can control every variable, predict every outcome, or shield every citizen from misfortune. The king understood that his obsession, though it had preserved the city in some ways, had also blinded him to vulnerabilities that were both human and structural. It was a lesson in humility, reminding him that leadership requires balance, not perfection, vigilance, not paranoia, and wisdom, not mere control. As rebuilding continued, these lessons shaped the approach to governance. Policies were reformed to promote fairness, security, and collaboration. Infrastructure projects were redesigned to prioritize both beauty and practicality, learning from mistakes that fire had painfully highlighted. The city's fortifications were strengthened, yet in a way that respected the flow of life, ensuring that defense did not suffocate daily activity. Even cultural and religious practices were adapted, emphasizing resilience, reflection, and communal support alongside tradition and ritual. The city became a living lesson in the consequences of ambition and the rewards of prudence. Communities absorbed these lessons as well. Neighbors who had once been distant became allies in rebuilding efforts, realizing that survival and prosperity depended upon cooperation, not isolation. Families worked alongside strangers, soldiers assisted artisans, and leaders consulted citizens on practical solutions for reconstruction. The scars of fire were visible, but they served as reminders of the strength and unity that could emerge when people faced shared adversity. The city, previously a monument to a single ruler's vision, was transforming into a testament to collective resilience. Education took on a new role in this reborn city. Scholars and teachers incorporated the events of the fire and the reconstruction into lessons that emphasized both history and morality. Children were taught not only mathematics, art, and literature but also the consequences of unchecked obsession, the necessity of foresight, and the value of empathy. Stories of heroism, of selflessness, of mistakes learned and corrected, became integral to daily learning. The lessons etched in stone were now etched into minds as well, ensuring that future generations would carry both knowledge and wisdom forward. Temples and civic spaces were repurposed as centers for reflection and guidance. Priests and civic leaders spoke of balance, between ambition and humility, vigilance and trust, creation and destruction. Rituals incorporated remembrance of the fire, honoring both the lives lost and the resilience of the survivors. Citizens found comfort in these practices, understanding that while the city could be scarred, its spirit was enduring. The fire had destroyed structures, but it could not destroy lessons learned and wisdom gained. Even the king himself internalized these lessons deeply. He became more measured in decision-making, more patient in governance, and more attentive to the humanity of those around him. His obsession, once a relentless drive for perfection, was tempered by empathy and foresight. He understood that power is not merely exercised through control but through guidance, cooperation, and the cultivation of loyalty and trust. The fire had taught him that brilliance without balance is fragile, and that the greatest legacy of leadership is not monuments or walls, but the well-being, wisdom, and resilience of those you lead. Lessons were communicated in subtle ways, through the architecture and design of the rebuilt city. Streets were wider to allow easier movement in emergencies. Marketplaces were constructed with multiple exits to prevent overcrowding during crises. Watchtowers and gates were designed for both defense and the welfare of citizens, balancing strategic necessity with care for daily life. Even aesthetic choices, from frescoes to sculptures, conveyed morality tales, reminders of the consequences of arrogance, the virtue of courage, and the enduring strength of community. In every stone laid, a lesson was embedded for future generations. In the months that followed, the city transformed not only physically but culturally. Festivals celebrated not only survival but wisdom. Rituals honored both courage and compassion. Storytellers recounted the fire, emphasizing both the tragedy and the lessons learned. These narratives, woven into daily life, created a culture of reflection, foresight, and shared responsibility. The city, once defined by ambition and singular brilliance, became defined by collective memory, resilience, and the conscious application of lessons gained through suffering. Trade and diplomacy, too, were informed by these lessons. The city approached neighboring kingdoms with measured caution, strengthened not merely by walls and armies, but by the understanding that alliances, communication, and mutual respect were as vital to survival as military might. Envoys carried not just messages but wisdom gained from experience, that empathy and foresight are as powerful as strategy, and that survival often depends on learning from both triumphs and failures. The city's reputation shifted from one of wealth and brilliance alone to one of enduring strength, wisdom, and prudence. Citizens, now participants in the ongoing story of the city, carried the lessons into their daily lives. Workplaces, homes, and communities reflected the understanding that vigilance and preparation were necessary, but only effective when paired with trust, cooperation, and reflection. Children learned to respect both achievement and caution, understanding that ambition must be tempered by awareness of consequences. Even the smallest actions, how a street was swept, how a roof was repaired, how a neighbor was helped, became part of a collective ethos shaped by the lessons etched in stone. The king often revisited the sites of destruction, not to mourn endlessly, but to observe how the lessons were taking root. He walked through streets where communities had rebuilt with care and innovation, observing how citizens applied wisdom gleaned from disaster. He saw how knowledge was passed from parent to child, how courage and prudence intertwined, and how collective action could achieve what any single ruler, no matter how brilliant, could not. Each observation reinforced the understanding that survival and greatness are inseparable from the lessons learned along the way. Ultimately, the lessons etched in stone were also etched into memory, creating a bridge between history and future possibility. The fire had been catastrophic, but it had illuminated truths that might otherwise have been ignored, that vigilance without humanity leads to fear, that ambition without balance leads to downfall, and that true greatness requires both courage and wisdom. The city, rising from the ashes, carried not only new structures but an enriched consciousness, a city whose streets, temples, and homes told stories of both devastation and the enduring power of human insight. As the king gazed upon the rebuilt city, he understood that history was not merely a record of events, but a teacher. Every wall, every plaza, every monument was now infused with lessons for the present and the future. The Golden Age, though scarred, had matured into something deeper, a civilization shaped not only by ambition and wealth, but by resilience, reflection, and the wisdom of experience. The lessons etched in stone would endure, guiding citizens and rulers alike, ensuring that the story of fire, loss, and rebirth would never be forgotten. The city, having survived fire and chaos, became the ultimate testament to the vision and determination of its king. Yet legacy is rarely measured by buildings alone, it is reflected in the hearts, minds, and spirits of those who inhabit a place. The king's legacy was not only in marble and stone, nor solely in towers and gates, but in the resilience he inspired, the wisdom he imparted, and the courage he modeled during both triumph and catastrophe. Through destruction and renewal, his influence had become permanent, woven into the daily rhythm of life and the very culture of the city. Citizens spoke often of the king, recounting both his brilliance and his flaws. They remembered his obsession, which had pushed the city to heights of glory, but also his capacity for reflection, which had guided them through the aftermath of devastation. Teachers used his life as a case study in balance, how ambition can drive greatness, but unchecked ambition can endanger even the most magnificent creation. Parents shared these stories with children, emphasizing that true leadership requires both vision and empathy. In this way, the king's legacy became not simply historical, but deeply personal, shaping moral understanding across generations. The physical landscape of the city bore his mark as well. Rebuilt streets, fortified walls, and carefully planned marketplaces were tangible reminders of the lessons learned from fire. Each decision in reconstruction reflected his evolved approach to governance, combining foresight with practicality, ambition with humility, and strategy with compassion. Temples, once symbolic of wealth and grandeur, now also represented reflection, remembrance, and communal strength. Every citizen, walking through these spaces, encountered the dual legacy of the king, the brilliance that once inspired awe, and the wisdom that now inspired trust, unity, and resilience. Diplomats and neighboring kingdoms took note of the city's transformation. Once, they had seen only the king's ambition and the city's wealth. Now, they saw a civilization forged in fire, tempered by experience, and guided by careful leadership. Alliances shifted from transactional convenience to mutual respect, built upon recognition that survival and prosperity were inseparable from the ability to learn, adapt, and endure. The king's legacy extended beyond walls and citizens, influencing relationships, diplomacy, and the broader perception of leadership across territories. Stories of heroism and sacrifice during the Night of Fire were embedded into the city's culture, serving as a complement to the king's personal legacy. Citizens who risked their lives to save neighbors, soldiers who held walls against overwhelming odds, and artisans who labored through rubble to rebuild became living symbols of courage and resilience. These narratives intertwined with lessons of leadership, reminding everyone that while the king guided the city, its enduring strength depended on collective effort, moral integrity, and shared determination. The king himself reflected often on the nature of legacy. He understood that greatness is fragile if measured only by monuments, wealth, or power. True legacy, he realized, is a combination of influence, teaching, and example. His obsession, once a force that nearly consumed the city, had been refined into a drive to inspire, guide, and protect. Where fire had destroyed structures, reflection rebuilt wisdom. Where chaos had tested loyalty, courage forged unity. The king's role, therefore, was no longer merely that of ruler but of steward, a custodian of both human life and shared knowledge. One remarkable aspect of his legacy was the integration of lessons into daily life. Education became infused with history, morality, and practical guidance. Children learned about courage, preparation, humility, and resilience alongside mathematics, writing, and the arts. Artisans, soldiers, and merchants shared knowledge not just of trade or technique, but of how to act with foresight, empathy, and responsibility. The city became a living classroom, with the king's life serving as an example of both brilliance and the importance of learning from mistakes. Communities flourished under this legacy. Citizens became active participants in governance, consulted on rebuilding, trade, and cultural development. The city's rhythm balanced innovation with tradition, ambition with ethical practice, and personal achievement with collective well-being. The king's influence was evident not only in strategy and planning but in the enduring attitudes and behaviors of those who lived under his guidance. Legacy, in this sense, was inseparable from daily life, present in the interactions, decisions, and values of each citizen. Temples, public squares, and civic spaces were dedicated not only to worship or ceremony but to the remembrance of lessons learned. Statues and inscriptions commemorated both the tragedy of fire and the courage displayed in its aftermath. Citizens, walking these spaces, were reminded that survival requires foresight, that ambition must be tempered by empathy, and that every individual plays a role in the health and prosperity of the community. Legacy, thus, was both a moral compass and a tangible framework for continued growth. The king's legacy was also a reflection of change in himself. He had transformed from a ruler consumed by obsession into a wise steward capable of reflection, balance, and guidance. His earlier intensity, once a source of fear, had evolved into measured dedication, inspiring confidence rather than trepidation. Citizens learned not only to respect authority but to trust it when tempered by experience and care. The king's personal evolution became inseparable from the city's transformation, showing that true legacy is as much about inner growth as it is about external achievement. Even in foreign lands, the story of the king's leadership spread. Scholars, diplomats, and travelers marveled not only at the city's reconstruction but at the enduring wisdom that guided it. Lessons of resilience, empathy, and strategic thinking were discussed in courts and academies, influencing governance, diplomacy, and societal expectations far beyond the city's borders. The king's legacy became both local and universal, a testament to the enduring relevance of learned experience and considered leadership. The passage of time did not diminish the king's influence. Generations that followed honored his memory through continued practice of the lessons instilled in the aftermath of fire. Festivals commemorated both survival and wisdom, ensuring that even as memory faded, the principles guiding the city remained active and influential. Citizens maintained rebuilt structures with care, passed stories to children, and upheld social bonds, reflecting a culture shaped by reflection and experience. The king's legacy, therefore, was not static but dynamic, continuing to shape life long after the Night of Fire had passed. The city itself became a symbol of endurance, a living monument to the king's combined ambition and wisdom. Travelers and historians marveled at its architecture, planning, and cohesion, but they also noted the invisible threads of leadership, empathy, and learned experience that held it together. Walls, towers, and marketplaces told one story, but the culture, values, and behaviors of citizens told another, that true greatness lies not only in creation but in the ability to guide, adapt, and endure. Ultimately, the king's legacy was a reminder that history remembers both triumph and tragedy, brilliance and folly. His life demonstrated that ambition can drive extraordinary achievement, but that wisdom and empathy are required to sustain it. The Night of Fire had tested him, his city, and his people, revealing vulnerabilities and strengths alike. From those trials emerged a legacy that transcended marble and gold, etched instead into the character, consciousness, and resilience of an entire civilization. In every rebuilt street, in every teaching, in every act of courage and foresight, the king's influence remained. It was a legacy not of fear, but of wisdom, not of obsession, but of reflection, not of singular ambition, but of collective strength. And as the Golden City continued to flourish, generations remembered that the greatest monument a leader can leave is not a wall or tower, but the enduring spirit, knowledge, and moral courage of those they guide. As years passed, the city continued to thrive, not only as a center of wealth and architecture, but as a living monument to endurance, wisdom, and reflection. The memory of the fire remained, yet it no longer symbolized only tragedy. Instead, it became a lens through which citizens and rulers alike understood the delicate balance of ambition, resilience, and moral responsibility. The lessons of that night, etched into stone and spirit alike, guided every decision, every act, and every thought within the city's walls. In this way, the past became not merely memory, but a compass for the future. The king, whose reign had been marked by brilliance, obsession, and ultimate wisdom, often walked alone through the rebuilt streets in quiet contemplation. The sunlight glimmered on the marble, lanterns still lit in the evening, and the sounds of life, children playing, merchants calling, soldiers training, created a rhythm both familiar and comforting. He reflected not only on what he had built, but on what had been destroyed, on the choices made in moments of fire and fear, and on the insights gained from both suffering and triumph. In this reflection, he found a deeper understanding of leadership, of human nature, and of the fragility and resilience inherent in life itself. Citizens too engaged in reflection, often sharing stories of courage and resilience with the younger generation. Parents recounted nights of fear and moments of bravery, emphasizing that true courage is not the absence of fear but the persistence to act despite it. Teachers incorporated these lessons into daily learning, weaving narratives of moral choice, perseverance, and collective responsibility alongside reading, mathematics, and craftsmanship. Temples echoed with prayers not only for protection and guidance but for gratitude, for survival, for community, and for the wisdom that emerges through adversity. The city's architecture became a tangible record of reflection. Buildings, streets, and public spaces were designed to honor both past mistakes and the lessons they had imparted. Defensive structures were balanced with spaces for leisure and community, fortifications with gardens, towers with open squares. Each decision in design reflected contemplation, a careful consideration of practicality, morality, and aesthetics. The fire had revealed the limits of human control, and every stone placed in reconstruction carried that awareness, guiding the city toward resilience and harmony rather than mere grandeur. The king's personal legacy intertwined with these reflections. He had once been consumed by obsession, by the need to control every variable, to perfect every detail, to shield his city from uncertainty. But reflection had tempered that intensity with wisdom, transforming him into a ruler who valued empathy, foresight, and balance alongside ambition and brilliance. Citizens recognized this evolution, respecting him not only for his achievements, but for his capacity to learn, adapt, and embody the lessons of fire and renewal. His life became a model for measured action, considered leadership, and the integration of experience into ongoing decision-making. Across the city, rituals and commemorations reinforced this ethos. Annual festivals marked not only survival but reflection, honoring both tragedy and triumph, courage and humility. Citizens participated in acts of remembrance, storytelling, and communal labor, recognizing that the fire's lessons were not static but dynamic, informing daily life, governance, and culture. Temples hosted reflective ceremonies, schools incorporated moral instruction alongside academic subjects, and families passed stories from generation to generation. The city itself became a teacher, offering ongoing lessons through its rebuilt streets, thriving markets, and resilient communities. Even diplomacy reflected these timeless reflections. The city approached neighboring kingdoms not solely through displays of strength or wealth, but with the wisdom born of experience. Envoys emphasized collaboration, foresight, and mutual respect, demonstrating that the greatest power is often knowledge and restraint rather than sheer force. Neighboring rulers observed and learned, recognizing that the city's endurance was as much a product of moral insight and careful reflection as of walls, armies, or treasures. The king's example extended beyond borders, shaping perceptions of leadership, strategy, and ethical governance. Citizens internalized these reflections in profound ways. Community planning, commerce, and daily interactions were guided by lessons learned from fire and recovery. Safety, fairness, and cooperation became embedded in civic life, creating a culture that valued foresight as much as action, empathy as much as ambition. Even the smallest decisions, how to repair a roof, organize a market, or settle a dispute, were informed by the understanding that the consequences of neglect, obsession, or hubris could be devastating. Reflection was no longer passive, it was active, shaping behavior, policy, and culture at every level. The king also engaged in personal reflection, often contemplating the transient nature of life, the fleeting quality of material achievement, and the enduring value of wisdom and compassion. He recognized that the fire, while devastating, had revealed the essence of human resilience and the true sources of societal strength. It was a lesson in humility, that even rulers, no matter how brilliant, are subject to forces beyond their control. Yet it was also a lesson in possibility, that recovery, innovation, and moral growth can emerge even from the most overwhelming trials. Stories of the Night of Fire continued to be shared, not merely as historical recounting, but as moral and philosophical reflection. Citizens discussed decisions made in moments of fear, the courage displayed in dire circumstances, and the consequences of both wisdom and error. These stories, combined with the tangible evidence of rebuilt streets, towers, and homes, created a multi-layered reflection, intellectual, emotional, and practical. Reflection, in this sense, was both narrative and experience, a guide for navigating present challenges and anticipating future uncertainties. As time advanced, even the city's youngest inhabitants began to internalize these reflections instinctively. Children, playing among restored streets and rebuilt structures, learned lessons of cooperation, foresight, and moral responsibility alongside practical skills. Games, storytelling, and communal projects subtly conveyed the importance of empathy, courage, and reflection. The fire, though distant in time, continued to influence behavior, decision-making, and values, ensuring that the lessons etched in stone and spirit endured across generations. The king's personal reflections extended into mentorship and guidance for future leaders. He cultivated advisors, generals, and administrators who embodied the principles of balance, foresight, and ethical responsibility. These individuals, trained in the art of reflection as much as in strategy or governance, ensured continuity of wisdom and moral leadership. The city's future, therefore, was safeguarded not merely by walls or fortifications, but by the cultivation of thoughtful, conscientious stewards who understood the delicate interplay of power, responsibility, and human nature. Even artistic and cultural expression reflected these reflections. Musicians, poets, and sculptors incorporated themes of resilience, moral choice, and the interplay between destruction and renewal. Art became a medium for reflection, offering citizens a way to process experience, internalize lessons, and celebrate both survival and growth. Architecture, music, literature, and ritual intertwined to create a city where reflection was not merely cognitive but experimental, present in the sights, sounds, and rhythms of daily life. Ultimately, timeless reflections became the defining characteristic of the city. Citizens, rulers, and visitors alike recognized that its enduring strength did not reside solely in stone, wealth, or military might, but in the cultivation of awareness, empathy, and wisdom. The Night of Fire, once a symbol of destruction, had been transformed into a foundation for ongoing moral, social, and civic reflection. In every decision, every action, every story and lesson, the city demonstrated that human insight and ethical vigilance are the truest sources of lasting greatness. The king, in his final years, often walked quietly through the city at dawn or dusk, observing the flow of life with a sense of both humility and pride. Streets teeming with commerce, laughter echoing from restored homes, soldiers practicing alongside artisans, all reflected the culmination of fire, recovery, and reflection. He understood that legacy is not merely what one builds, but how one shapes thought, behavior, and culture over time. His life, marked by ambition, obsession, catastrophe, and wisdom, had become inseparable from the city's identity, a continuous reflection of human potential and responsibility. And so, the Golden City endured. Towers and walls stood tall not only as monuments to ambition, but as reminders of reflection, resilience, and moral responsibility. Citizens, guided by lessons etched in stone, story, and culture, navigated life with awareness, courage, and empathy. The king's influence, shaped by both brilliance and reflection, continued to guide generations. The fire had tested them all, but reflection ensured they thrived, creating a civilization where history, wisdom, and human spirit converged. Time passed, but the lessons, stories, and reflections persisted. Travelers spoke of the city not only for its beauty, wealth, and grandeur, but for the moral and cultural depth cultivated through fire, loss, and renewal. Scholars studied its history, leaders emulated its governance, and citizens lived its principles daily. The Golden City had transformed from a monument of ambition to a living testament to reflection, learning, and the enduring resilience of the human spirit. And in the quiet moments, as night fell and lanterns illuminated streets, one could walk through the city and feel the weight of history, the echo of choices made, and the lasting presence of reflection. It was in these moments that the legacy of the king and his city truly resonated, not in grandeur alone, but in the enduring wisdom, resilience, and moral insight passed down across generations. Fire had scarred, but reflection had preserved, guided, and elevated the city into timelessness.